a chance for the file. All right, it's letting you do it. Okay.
Yep.
Perfect.
All right, so you want me to do it for mine then?
Yeah, leave it alone. Don't change it, and then we'll
All right.
go ahead. So, all right. Wrong screen, Bill. Or Maggie, you shared your screen? There you go. All right, I'm going to broadcast and we'll go live.
All right, sounds good.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's ACPE Academy webinar. Sorry about the technical difficulties as we got started, but we wanted to make sure that we're able to record today's webinar. My name is Mark Medwed. I'm the program manager at the ACPE. Today's topic, dimensions of grief and loss in the lives of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and pastoral strategies for addressing them, is a repeat of one of our webinars from this series, focusing on pastoral care of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families and caregivers. Our presenters are Bill Gaventa, the director of the Summer Institute on Theology and Disability and Collaborative on Faith and Disability, and Maggie Cobb, who is a staff chaplain at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback from the ACPE Academy webpage. We also have the slides from the presentation as well as additional resources. At the conclusion of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to post questions for the presenters. When you move your mouse on the screen, you will see a Q&A button. Click on the button and type your question. Due to the potentially high number of questions that will be asked, please know that not all questions may be answered as part of the webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Bill and Maggie.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for your patience as we work out the bugs. Technology is great when it works. Thank you so much for joining us again today for what is kind of an encore presentation in this series. Bill and I began working together around issues of disability a few months back, I guess maybe December or so, because there's really a lot of issues that are coming to the forefront right now with disabilities and particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities in areas of healthcare decision-making. We've been working together with another group of kind of academics and policymakers, along with Trace Haythorne representing the ACPE. And it's really a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that issues of grief and loss really feel familiar to us as chaplains and pastoral caregivers. And I hope that what we can do today is not entirely reinvent the wheel, but to simply build on the repertoire of skills that you already have. So I hope it'll feel a little more accessible for you. And I love this. Mom, what is normal? The little girl is saying. It's just a setting on the dryer, honey. It's one of the things that I like to use to sort of break the ice in my presentations, because I think there's a lot of value to normal. And I think that when we sort of expand our view and look at everyone's grief responses as potentially normal for them, it really allows us to see the humanity in each other, regardless of where we are in our stage of life. So Bill's going to kick it off for us, talking about grief and loss.
So think about some of the normal assumptions about grief and loss, and some of them that impact those issues when working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. First of all, is people say, well, what can people understand? Can they understand grief or loss or death? And then sometimes that's absolutely ruled people out of even trying to address that, which as you all know, in the grief and language parlance and theory is what you would call disenfranchised grief, not having the chance to have that expressed or related to. There are also assumptions about whether people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can feel in the same way. Maybe assumptions that we as clergy have about your ability, capacity to deal with a person with intellectual or developmental disabilities as a pastor or personally, if you've not had experience or training. There may be assumptions that come from some of the literature out there around grief and loss and people with disabilities. For instance, in the 60s, there was a theorist, a psychologist who wrote a paper about the chronic sorrow that families of children with disabilities felt, as if they were in grief all the time. And that was a particular lens, but that's not the experience that's only one part of the experience that most families will tell you is part of their life and part of their repertoire of feelings. Only one part. We also make assumptions about a grief process at times, and thinking that people need to go through a process like as if it's a procedure, when that we know that's not the case. And they're usually anything related to people with disabilities in medical settings, the prognosis is usually negative or worse than it might be for other people, simply because of the disability. So one of the key strategies here is anytime you want to ask a question about whether or not I can do this, or a person with a developmental disability feels this, or how this applies, ask the question in reverse. Ask that, how would I do this for me? Or how would I do this with anybody else? And then start from there, which takes away kind of the immediate assumption of difference between you and them. There are numbers of theological issues that get involved as well, like why the disability, why me as a person with a disability, why my child, whose fault may this have been. Responsibility becomes kind of a paradox, because we would say, like in John 9, it's not that man's fault or his parents' fault that he was born blind. But in fact, sometimes disability is caused by human error or human responsibility, such as and environmentally pollution that we know causes some forms of disabilities, or certainly acquired disabilities. That's often the case. Faith, healing, and cure, those are all issues that people with disabilities and their family members struggle with, especially struggling with the being an object of somebody else's attempts to want to help by praying over or trying to heal a person. And the spiritual history and stories that you will hear from most people with disabilities, or maybe a good half of people with disabilities and their families, are ones often of being neglected by clergy or faith communities, or when it turns into the kinds of, if you prayed harder, you could be healed, or what did you do? I mean, there are people asking people to leave a faith community because of their disability. I think those work into the realm of what we might call spiritual abuse. There are lots of places where grief and loss may occur. It may happen at a prenatal or postnatal diagnosis, before a birth. It may happen, or before a birth, or after, as during a discovery because of a test beforehand. It may happen right after birth, such as often happens with a person with Down syndrome, when that discovery is made after birth, or with a difficult birth that's resulted in cerebral palsy, although nobody knows at that point what the extent of the disability would be. It may be diagnoses later in childhood after problems or issues are discovered, such as typically is the case with autism. Kathleen Bolduc is a mom who's written several books about faith and autism and her son. And the first one was, his name is Joel, which comes out of a doctor relationships and being with a doctor who kept on talking about her son as this autistic kid, and that, yada, 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 until she finally said, his name is Joel. He is a person. He's a kid. And let's start from there. It may come from accident or trauma, leading to a cognitive disability, or it may be aging and classic regular end-of-life transitions. But the list can get longer. For families, typical experiences that get heightened by a disability. What do I do now as a new parent? What about the usual celebrations of birth or rites of passage? How are other people responding to me and to the birth of our child? Can we find the kinds of services and supports that we might need? A crisis later on, as a child has gotten older, may lead to kicking up kind of the initial crisis again, like it does with many of us around grief and loss experiences. As children move into adolescence, new questions arise. And then especially from adolescence to young adulthood, as young people typically move out of a home, but oftentimes young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities don't do that. When there is that transition, there's always the gift and the grief around the empty nest, the hope and the fears that go with that. And as an adult with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they are dealing with loss of relatives and parents as they get older. And then the whole question of helping adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities prepare for their own death or deal with the death of their friends in a variety of kinds of settings.
I'm going to jump in here. Bill, do we have the slides that have the Welcome to Holland? I think we might be on a different version
Oh my goodness.
of the presentation.
Yeah, we do, but I'd have to go out. Can you just read it?
Yep, absolutely. One of the things that Bill talked about was during rites of passage, the things that happen normally, yeah, there's that word again, normal, over the course of a child's life. Sometimes we encounter these moments for families with disabilities where things, due to the nature of the disability, are slightly different. And in addition to my role here as a staff chaplain at the hospital, one of the things that I am blessed to be a part of is a family with a disability. I have an almost 11-year-old son who is on the autism spectrum. And I want to share with you, and we might be able to get it up on the screen, a poem called Welcome to Holland. And it is a well-known poem among disability circles. And it was shared with us by the preschool teacher that my son's class had. And it is written by a woman named Emily Pearl Kingsley. So bear with me while I share this with you. She writes, "When you're going to have a baby, it's like planning a fabulous vacation trip to Italy. You buy a bunch of guidebooks and you make wonderful plans. The Colosseum, the Michelangelo David, the gondolas in Venice. You may learn some handy phrases in Italian, and it's all very exciting. After months of eager anticipation, the day finally arrives. You pack your bags, and off you go. Several hours later, the plane lands, and the stewardess comes in and says, 'Welcome to Holland.' Holland, you say? What do you mean Holland? I signed up for Italy. I'm supposed to be in Italy. All my life I've dreamed about going to Italy. But there's been a change in the flight plan. They've landed in Holland, and there you must stay. The important thing is that they haven't taken you to a horrible, disgusting, filthy place full of pestilence, famine, and disease. It's just a different place. So you must go out and buy all new guidebooks, and you must listen and learn a whole new language. You will meet a whole new group of people who you never would have met. It's just a different place. It's lower paced than Italy, less flashy than Italy. But after you've been there for a while and you catch your breath, you look around and you begin to notice that Holland has windmills and Holland has tulips. Holland even has Rembrandts. But everyone you know is busy coming and going from Italy, and they're all bragging about what a wonderful time they've had there. And for the rest of your life, you will say, yes, that is where I was supposed to go. That is what I had planned. And the pain of that will never, ever, ever go away. Because the loss of that dream is very, very significant loss. But if you spend your life mourning the fact that you didn't get to Italy, you may never be free to enjoy the very special, the very lovely things about Holland. So that is one of the things that I think helped us as families to really readjust our focus. The grief is absolutely a real thing. Here's the end of the poem. The grief that families feel is absolutely a real thing. But being stuck in that grief doesn't need to be where a family who has a member with a disability stays. So let's click ahead, I think 2 more slides, and we're going to take a look at grief at different ages. Death and grieving for children, and this is really focused on children at an earlier age, can be really tricky. And when you add an issue of a disability on top of that tricky issue, it can feel even more complex. But some important reminders that come from Pathfinders for Autism are these things. Try to explain it as fully as possible. Go through it with age-appropriate information and describe that the person has in fact died. One of the tools that you can use is something called a social story. For people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it can be really challenging to grasp the entirety of a situation. So a social story will break it down kind of into bite-sized chunks. And you can use them for any major transition. Anything from potty training to coping with death to moving into a new house. And it examines each micro motion of that life event and provides reassurance. So you will go to the funeral home and it is okay. There will be family and friends there and that will feel okay. You will get to see the person who has died in the casket and that will be okay. So it's a really nice way to sort of break it down into reassuring pieces. Also, keeping details concrete is incredibly important. I think that as chaplains and people in ministry, we can be very good at using sort of flowery language, and we can talk about how the person has passed away or they have fallen asleep in the Lord. This is really not the time for flowery language and euphemisms. So if a person has died, use the D word, say that they have died, say that they are dead, and encourage other people around you to use that very concrete language so that it can help the person with an intellectual disability really begin to process it. Another handy tip is to talk about memories and provide reassurance. So if you're talking about, say, a grandparent who has passed away, you can talk about, remember the time that we got to go fishing with Grandpa. Remember the fish that you caught. Remember how wiggly the worms felt. Keep a focus on those memories and reassure them that it's okay to feel what they're feeling. It's okay to feel sad or angry. And in the midst of all of this transition, try to keep other aspects in that child's life as consistent as possible. Go ahead, one more to behavior speaks loudly. One of the cases that I've referenced a lot in talking about people with intellectual disabilities is the case of Brian. In addition to covering the emergency department, I also have psych emergency. So we see people that need psychiatric evaluations, people that need inpatient hospitalization, and a fair amount of suicide cases. And a young man named Brian, who was about 19 or 20 years old, was on the autism spectrum, came in with what we recorded initially as a suicide attempt. Brian lived in residential housing. And of the several young men that lived together, one of them was essentially graduating, moving on to live in a new place. And they were having all of these behavioral concerns with the other young men in the house. And in a fit of anger, Brian, the young man in our psych emergency, shoved really hard into a wall. The wall gave way, and he ended up with all of these cuts all over his forearms. And so what it looked like is that he had gashes on his forearms, and they thought, oh my gosh, he's tried to take his own life. What actually was going on, the more that we were able to dig into this, is that it wasn't a suicide attempt at all. This was his attempt to cope with his grief and his loss about a person that he had lived with who was now going away. So rather than treat this like a suicide attempt, we were treating this now as a grief response. And even though he wasn't able to necessarily form the words to say, I'm going to miss my friend, I feel terrible that this is happening, his behaviors were actually speaking for him. So his behaviors became his communication.
So as kids move into adolescence, we sometimes tongue-in-cheek use the phrase, "You gave me a lot of grief today." Well, you know, those feelings of who's in, who's out, those issues of friendship, social connections, really where people are trying to figure out who they are and their identity and whether they're part of the in crew or out crew. Kids with disabilities, unless people are pretty intentional about this, at having friends and others, can sometimes really get have a hard time in that kind of transition. That's beginning to change now. There's beginning to be creative ways of kids having grown up together in church and school, mentorship programs and others where kids are much more used to having classmates and even friendships with kids with developmental disabilities. And think about, for congregations, what an important opportunity this would be for congregational youth programs to explore around the issue of disability, what it means to be a child of God, what it means to be a person, what it means to be part of community, and what our faith tradition says, respective faith tradition says, about how people with disabilities are part of God's people as well. As you move into young adulthood, as Meg just talked about, Brian, the loss of a friend that was moving away, or other kinds of losses like that, search for a meaningful adult roles after education entitlement means that's a word out of the system. Families are entitled to education up for their child up to age 21. And the story I've got briefly is of a Unitarian church in Connecticut who had a son with Down syndrome who moved to 21. He'd been with the youth group all along. All of his fellow friends in the youth group were going away to college and moving on. The family wanted him to still be with the youth group because that was they thought that had been such a valuable experience for him, but that youth group was not his youth group. These were younger kids than he was now. He was older. He was a young adult. And what was needed there was a very intentional, planful collaboration and dialogue between family and church and others about how do we help this young man to move into an adult role in the congregation and build other kinds of relationships. Young adulthood and adulthood for people with disabilities often deals with lots of loneliness and issues of intimacy and close relationships, boyfriends and girlfriends. I got an email yesterday that was one of the ones I get occasionally about, Bill, do you know about good premarital counseling materials for two adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities? And again, the first kind of response is, what do you do usually? What do you trust? And then how you might adapt that and working with people. And then staying at home, moving out. A huge percentage of adults with autism live at home. And about 70% of all adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities live in their family homes. We think that most of them maybe are in group homes or other things, but that's not the case. There are adult losses. And one of the key, I can't tell you how many times what this has happened when people, in my experience, when a person, an adult with an intellectual developmental disability has lost a family member or a relative, and the rest of the family calls and says, we would prefer that he or she not come to the funeral. Maybe perhaps they don't want to get the person upset. Maybe they're worried about behavior. There are all kinds of reasons. But what happens there, of course, is really denial of the grief process and disenfranchisement. And for people who need to feel and see and go through things concretely, not intellectually, it just makes that all the harder. For many people who are served in support systems, group homes, there's rampant turnover. So close relationships turn over, and then people are expected to trust people again and get close to other people, which involves a continual series of grief and loss, and then trying to maybe trust again, which can become harder and harder. And then loss of friends from multiple transitions and movements, especially out of institutions, maybe to community settings. We had a CPE student in my program in New Jersey when I was there who did a spiritual assessment of the people served by the agency in the community where she was assigned. And the assessment worked around what's most important to you, not what do you believe, but what's most important to you in your life. and she got staff to help her do this question, and they organized all the responses, got them in a database, and then used the Wordle process to make a graphic about their responses. And I'm not sure if you can read all this, but almost the bigger the letters, the more people said something just like this. And you can see, hopefully in here, how many of these things that are most important to people are about friendships and relationships and death and loss, and just so much of that about what's most important in people's lives, and which goes right hand in hand with something Jean Vanier has said in his writings, that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities live in the world of relationships more so than in accomplishments or other kinds of things. And that's what's so important to them in so many different ways. So in the old systems of care, aging and death was often out of sight and out of mind because people were in institutions. But now sometimes in even the newer systems, death becomes a key indicator of loneliness or loss of connections. There was a New York Times piece about a family who got reconnected with a brother who'd been institutionalized only after their parents had died, because the parents had never mentioned or never told the story about their institutionalizing their son back in the days when that was quiet and hush-hush. It's an indication of injustice and no power, sometimes for people at the systems, of being abandoned, and of family wounds. Early in my chaplaincy, there was a death of a young woman, 26, in an institution I was working in Rochester. And her family, she died because she was pretty severely disabled, died because of a behavior called pica, where people ingest anything that's in their path, in a sense, sort of a way of self-stimulation. And she grabbed a rubber glove one day when staff weren't looking, and that was our hygiene glove, and ended up suffocating. Her parents came a couple of days later, and I was in a meeting with them and the doctor, and they were livid at the doctor and at what had happened. And I was kind of curious, because I had never seen them like I'd seen many other families around the facility very often, so it didn't seem like they had an active relationship with her. But as I listened to them more and more, what I realized was that they were yelling at the doctor, particularly the mother, and the doctor who was sitting in that room was not the doctor she saw. She was yelling at the doctor, the obstetrician, who 30 years ago had created the intellectual disability by a misuse of forceps. I mean, literally, it was your fault. It was your fault that this had happened. That was the doctor that was in the room with me. And so that those 27 years had gone by and ripped off, and that wound was still very, very raw. In new systems, people are often still lonely. They're often, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have few friends in their lives other than paid people or direct family members, siblings and relatives. Living in a community doesn't mean you're a part of it. There's disconnect sometimes between family and staff. If somebody's living in an agency, they become antagonists rather than partners. And then, as Maggie said earlier, routine medical care can sometimes become an end-of-life issue when a person with intellectual and developmental disability ends up in the hospital with a disease or a regular disease or illness, and people start making assumptions about their quality of life and how much treatment should we provide because of the person's disability. And as people with intellectual and developmental disabilities age and decline in a system that's geared upon helping them grow and develop, that's a radical shift in terms of philosophy and care in the very best of service systems and service providers in that area. There are new challenges and crises. Sometimes I've heard staff who are close to somebody say, sort of, damn it, why does this person have to die or face death? They've already had one strike against them and having a disability. Why this? Disability is part of another cultural group of people, of things that people consider curses and not blessings in their lives. And the anger by staff and others can be sometimes directed at families, at other staff. If something happens that where someone dies, somebody will, like in any extended family or caregiving, the question is, who's at fault? Did you do something? Is it some kind of unusual incident? And because deaths in the past were evidence of abuse, now in most systems, if somebody's in a service system, a death becomes triggers an unusual incident review, as if death is an unusual incident. Well, it's usual for all of us, but in systems, it gets treated sometimes as if somebody had to be at fault for that having happened. And so the challenges become, how do we process grief with family and friends through transitions and change, including turnover. And when turnover happens and the grief is not recognized, that gets worse. And then people in group homes and residential programs are working with staff who come from so many different cultural backgrounds these days. There are so many immigrants in service systems, particularly around the boundaries of our country in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and other places as well, where there are so many different assumptions about death and loss and what you do in a time of grief or loss. And then mixed into that are the stereotypes that come from faith, from disability. So it's a complex mixture in so many ways, with paradoxes about, well, they don't understand. So then if they don't understand quickly, we should give them more time and go slow to go through the feelings and experiences. But then there's pressures in the systems to move on quickly because we need to fill their slot or fill their bed in a group home. It's hard for agencies to realize that the key importance is relationships, 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 not a particular program or plan. And then there's that pressure to fill the empty bed or the empty slot, partly because of funding sources and funding issues. But this is an opportunity also for staff, for caregivers to revision a decline as also a journey. A time that pastors and clergy and others can help older people with disabilities think about, what do you want to do in this time of your life, at a place where you in particular can help agencies and parents and others as they begin to deal with aging, with issues of grief and loss. You're the community experts on this, not often the staff and other kinds of helping services and disciplines. So what are some of the key strategies that I've used all the time and recommend? Welcome it, of course. Any expression of grief, don't try to hide it. Welcome it and let it be shared. Create a safe space in an agency or anywhere for people to be able to talk about grief and loss with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their friends. People yearn to do so. It's sometimes sort of what I would say hidden in plain sight, but never talked about because people are not sure how. As Maggie said earlier, be alert for the ways people act out their behavior, act out what happens, and then on the flip side of that, let people act out in the ways that we all act out grief and loss appropriately. We act out in socially appropriate ways by visiting, by praying, by having memorial services, by sending cards, by looking at photos, by writing notes, by wakes, visiting the cemetery. Those are socially appropriate ways of acting out what we feel, even if we don't understand completely what's going on. And therefore, it's so valuable then for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to go through those actions and feelings rather than thinking this is a cognitive or intellectual process. I had CPE student at another agency in New Jersey where a guy was really acting out. He was new in their home, all kinds of psychiatric issues going on. And they found out, started digging, and found out that Thanksgiving was coming up. His mother had died the previous Thanksgiving. He had lived at home before, and he had never been able to go to the funeral or to go to the cemetery or any kind of appropriate rituals about that grief and loss. And she ended up working with him to have a memorial service at his home where he lived now, with staff, with friends. They together cooked his favorite meal that his mom used to cook, macaroni and cheese. So you had something to eat after the service, which we all do in most times in grief and loss. So gave a typical normal experience, even if it was late, and the behavior changed rather remarkably after that.
I read a wonderful article written by a young man who himself was on the autism spectrum about his encounter in the grieving process with another friend. And he wrote, "I know an individual close to my age with Asperger's, which is now under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder, whom I met in college. When discussing the death of someone we both knew, he said, 'Congratulations!' I felt that he knew that he was supposed to say something that acknowledged the death, but he didn't realize that we don't say congratulations at a funeral or in the context of the death of a loved one." These are the really subtle social scenarios that can be tremendously challenging for someone with an intellectual or developmental disability. So here's a good moment where we can help to model a better choice of something to say, just like finding more socially appropriate ways of grieving. So it's completely okay to provide alternatives when they feel, gosh, I need to say something. Give them good tools on this. You can say my condolences, or I'm so sorry, or I'm keeping your family in my prayers. Give them something concrete to focus on, a concrete set of choices to say, and that can actually be very empowering for them in that moment.
There's a kind of flip story to this too, a flip side of it, that sometimes the things that people say can be incredibly valuable and just a new perspective in a setting. And because people are kind of known for saying what they think. And the question is if it's appropriate. I never forget a wake where a couple of people from a group home came to visit the head of the executive director of the ARC, who had retired a month before and then died very unsuddenly after that. He was a beloved man. And so people came from the home to the wake when I was there. They were very upset. And when they got there, but everybody finally thought, oh, well, we finally helped people calm down, and then gave them each a companion, and they went in to see their friend Tom. And one of the guys who was there walked in with his walker and with Tom's wife and his daughter sitting in the front row, and he walks up to the open casket and says what everybody else was thinking about this very sudden death. He said, "This is just no damn good. This is just no damn good." And it just spoke to the heart of what every single person was saying, which was sometimes one of the value. In my experience, sometimes that's one of the really values of working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities around grief and loss, is because they will say things that sometimes people have been taught socially maybe they shouldn't say at all. And there's a place where some of that's very, very appropriate.
We call it sort of the gift of autism, that unbridled honesty in the moment.
So some of the key strategies for caregivers are simply provide honest information. Maggie said that. Honest, concrete, accurate. Enable maximum involvement in the activities. Help people stay connected to their key supporters. Who are the people who know that person best? Help those persons support that person, not call in the stranger who's a grief counselor, so to speak. And then maximize those opportunities for grief and loss and expression. Don't assume that it just needs to happen once.
We want to give you a little bit of nuance about sharing as much information. I mentioned age-appropriate information as you're talking about things. And if you're able to share the narrative of the illness, depending on the situation, it's really important to differentiate that this person who has died, their illness, does not necessarily equate to the next time the person with an IDD gets sick. So I've seen it where we'll try to give a very thorough explanation of Uncle Bob was very sick with cancer. He got an infection, he went to the hospital, and then he died. That creates a very different narrative than Uncle Bob was sick and then he died. Because then, good gracious, the next time I have a head cold, I might also die. Because when you're working with concrete thinking, making sure that Uncle Bob dying of cancer is a very separate entity from seasonal allergies or a head cold. So making sure that there's a distinction there. And also this idea that Bill touched on of wanting to protect and so keep away from the grief process. I know as an autism mom, my first instinct is to get very mama grizzly and say, I have to protect my child. I don't want him to feel the things that are awful. I don't want him to hurt. But the reality is that I'm denying him an opportunity if I completely shield him from the grieving process. Loss is hard and grief hurts. It hurts a lot. But I think there's some restoration of autonomy and honoring of personhood that goes along with allowing a loved one with an intellectual disability to go through those steps and to experience the grief process, even when it hurts.
In the resources that come along with this series, you'll see a collection of resources under the title Books Beyond Words. And it's a really creative group out of the UK, going back to this Maggie's thing about the narrative of illness, who put together picture books of adults going through an experience. And some of their first ones they did, and you can tell they're from the UK, one was when mom died, and another was when dad died, or when someone dies, or going to the hospital. And the idea is for people who don't read, is that for that person to be able to sit next to a caregiver or somebody who's close to them and go through the book and talk about the pictures and talk about the story and create the story. There are words you can use that are written as a text, but mostly it's about just to help people talk this through together and make it a narrative rather than an intellectual exercise so much of trying to understand them. They're really creative and unfortunately not very widely known about here in the States. So what are core pastoral roles? For me, over years, they merged or inducted into kind of 4 key ones around any role with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, and this is no different than anybody else. Presence, being willing to ask the story. Guidance, helping people as they look for the meaning and trying to understand what happened. Advocate, which we talked about in the 3rd webinar, but it's even more important here because if people don't have the opportunity to be able to express loss and grief or participate, there's a real role maybe here for advocacy. And then even more important, helping to build a community of support around someone who's experienced some kind of grief or loss in a congregation or an agency. Many agencies struggle with how to do this. And so this is an opportunity for your outreach to them. I'm going to move ahead one more and come back to a minute, where you could perhaps help agencies and staff develop some ways of talking about grief and loss with the people they support before it happens, just as part of their everyday programs and relationships, where you could help them build relationships with local resources. So the comforters who get called in on death or something are not unfamiliar or strangers. You could help some of those agencies address and honor spirituality. A lot of them want to, but don't know how. There's a strategy called a loss assessment, which agencies could use, which is when someone comes into their services, how could we find out about the family? What's their culture? What's their belief? Well, how do they usually handle grief and loss in their respective tradition? And how might you honor that with their son or daughter who's come into your services? And then to think about how you use person-centered planning for end-of-life wishes and advanced directive planning. There are resources about that in the resource list that have been developed to help adults and families and staff, adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, plan for that and to think ahead. And again, to sort of summarize some pastoral responses that we've both said. Hear the stories. Model the acceptance. Include people. Help people see the other parts of somebody's identity, not the disability, but the reason they love this person, their memories, the things they like to do with somebody, what they're going to miss most. Listen to the behavior. Talk to those people who know the person best if you don't know about how to particularly respond to that person. Remember that symbols and rituals can be so crucial. Prayer, rituals, being parts of services, cards, going to the cemetery. And the core, I think, in working with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities is being simple but not childish. Simple, direct to the point, and probably lots of other people would appreciate that too from us as pastoral caregivers at times. And use those core values that are in all the caregiving systems about person-centered, family-centered, patient-centered care. When we want to go off in some other direction, help bring it back to the person. Help bring it back to the person in as many ways as you can. One of the things that's done in some person-centered planning and now around grief and loss, and this is not a person with an intellectual and developmental disability, but out of person-centered planning, there's a strategy called a one-page profile of somebody. And this was a way of, this was a person not with intellectual developmental disabilities, but who wrote one up for herself and for her friends and others to know. What people need to know about me now. Things I don't want as you care for me in my terminal illness. What helps me feel better right now? And other things. So a profile that went into her chart that they could share with others, that were strategies and ways to keep people's care person-centered and working together. Clergy, staff, and friends have these paradoxical roles around end-of-life and grief experiences about both being with people as well as doing for people. You've got to really be with people, and then you'll find out what really needs done, not rushing in to do. How do we help care for people's needs as well as celebrating their gifts and their strengths? How do we know when people need specialized supports from people who are specialists in disability versus for professionals who work in that field? Can we give away what we know to other people and build upon their innate sense that they could do this if they knew how, and they don't trust themselves? Clergy don't trust themselves because it's not a category of people that they're used to dealing with. And so sometimes you rule yourselves out too quickly. In other words, people feel disabled about being able to relate to people with disabilities. Trust what you do with everybody else. And how do we as professionals and caregivers also know what we don't know, and then ask others and be able to invite others into circles of care? So there are resources at the end. Let's take some questions that you might have had in the minutes we have remaining. And Megan, you've got the questions, I think.
Yep, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A section, and then we will do our best to answer as many as we are able.
I've got up some of the resources. There's more on the list that are at the ACPE site that would go with this. There really is quite an astounding amount of resources around grief and loss with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in this country, finally. Other countries, New Zealand, Australia, European countries have been ahead in this. But we're finally beginning to see this, and hospices are beginning to have some experience and know about some of these resources as well.
Doesn't look like we've got any other questions popping up at this point.
I'm reminded of one other story, just briefly, at a group home that had some sensitivity. There was two stories, really. One was where somebody died, and the manager later told me that a person was moved into that person's room pretty quickly. which caused all kinds of anger directed at that new stranger. Instead of welcoming them, people then saw this person as moving into that person's room, and how dare you do that? You know, kind of like we didn't have time to grieve out of that lost space. And then at another one where the staff were very sensitive and someone died, and as the mom came, or the sister came to pick up his belongings, and she asked the question, would anybody here like some of the things he had? As a memento, a question that often didn't get asked. And of course there were people who wanted something. I always used to tell that story because one of his friends and buddies wanted his friend's Yankees hat, which was a memento because they were both fans of the Yankees. And as a non-Yankee fan, I would question their preference and what he wanted, but it's still, the point is there. Can people be sensitive enough to share mementos? And even think about beforehand with somebody, who would they like to give something to somebody with to help people remember somebody?
We've had a couple questions pop up. One is about printing out a copy of the slides and bibliography. Those are going to be on the ACPE's website. So Mark at the end will give you sort of a reminder of where to find those. We had another question about suggestions for providing good pastoral care for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in emergency situations, like when they come into the emergency department with a family member who dies suddenly. This is something that I definitely see on a fairly regular basis. I think emergencies have a way of heightening things for people. Emergencies tend to bring out our best and worst qualities in the moment of crisis. So I think a couple of tools for being in the midst of that crisis will be certainly modeling acceptance. We talked about modeling radical inclusivity and acceptance. So if the entire family is going into a family meeting or information with a doctor, make sure that you're including the member of the family that has a disability. So inclusion would be the first part of that. I think also deferring to the knowledge and expertise of the family would also be a good tip. Because if this is someone who is prone to violently express in an outburst or something like that, the family would have that information more than the emergency provider. But kind of striking a balance between inclusion, deferring to the family's expertise, and just doing what we do as people who practice pastoral care in terms of our presence with people as they journey through this difficult thing, I think are important. And then one other question that came up is about people in other countries. Bill, maybe you could take this one, about being more on the vanguard of dealing with loss and developmental disabilities. The person is asking, why have those other countries sort of gotten ahead of us here in the States?
I think it's a really good question. It may be that some of those other countries have not quite as paranoid ideas about death as we tend to do in America at times, and that some of them have been ahead of us in terms of including people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in community settings. So they also, some of those countries also have national health services, so there are, they're more part of the, quote, the mainstream, and that might have been part of that as well. And I want to make one comment on something Maggie just said, or one of the questions about a person coming in to the emergency room, an adult, because a parent has just died and is thinking about perhaps that person's been living with that parent. One of the key tragedies in the system these days is that there have not been plans made by families for that contingency. So what happens is nobody is prepared. So essentially what usually can happen is that an adult with an intellectual and developmental disability loses a parent and loses a home at the same time. Because if there's nobody to go back to or go live there, they end up going through two massive changes unless there's been some preparation and significant planning. And clergy can really help families think through the importance of doing that, and using things like the National ARC has a future planning website project to help families think about the future and make plans emotionally, spiritually, financially, in other ways, because that double transition usually means somebody gets placed in an emergency placement in some place that's completely strange and often far away from the people they know, and it's pretty bad.
Absolutely. And one final question just popped up about the Wordle graphic. I think that's accessible through the Wordle website, Bill?
I guess it could be accessible through the websites. It's kind of hard to, Wordle won't let you save stuff very well if you use it. You kind of, but if somebody, I've got the slide. If somebody wanted to email me, I could send the slide to them. And that's bill.gaventa@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you to Bill and Maggie. Our time is up, and we appreciate you doing this. We apologize once again for the technical challenges that we had in the beginning, but once again, we appreciate your expertise and your sharing the resources with us. And the recording of today's webinar will be on the ACPE website under the ACPE Academy webpage, which is on the resources section, as well as announcements of future webinars. So thanks for joining us, and have a wonderful day.